5.19%. That is the 30-year U.S. Treasury yield as of Tuesday, the highest reading since July 2007, the year before Lehman collapsed. In a single 24-hour window, bond markets, Beijing, Tehran, and Nvidia have all been bent by one decision sitting on one desk in Washington. 7 stories, one trigger, one desk in Washington. Stay with me for all 7. At the Great Hall of the People this Wednesday morning, China and Russia walked out side by side. They didn't just shake hands. They signed roughly 40 agreements covering energy, tourism, education, and security. They extended the 2001 Friendship Treaty. And in their joint statement, they openly attacked Washington's planned $175 billion Golden Dome missile shield, warning against a global return to, quote, the law of the jungle. Here is the number nobody is putting on cable news. Russia's oil exports to China grew 35% in the first quarter of 2026 alone. While Washington talks sanctions, Beijing is locking in cheap energy and a security partner on its border. 40 signed agreements in one day is not diplomacy. It is a quiet realignment. And it sets up the second story, the one that nearly set the Middle East on fire. A senior American official went on record this week saying he had personally called off a strike on Iran that was scheduled for Tuesday. He says Gulf allies, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, asked him to hold for 2 or 3 days because a deal was, in his words, very close. Tehran responded today, warning the United States to expect, quote, many more surprises if the war restarts. The clock is visibly ticking. Iran's 14-point proposal landed in Washington through Pakistan as a back channel. Tehran wants the shipping standoff resolved first and nuclear talks later. But that exact sequencing is what the White House refuses to accept. So global markets are now pricing in one likely outcome, another shock. And that is where the third story begins, because the moment those headlines hit the wire, something cracked deep inside the bond market. The 30-year U.S. Treasury yield touched 5.197% on Tuesday. That is the highest reading since July 2007, before Lehman, before the financial crisis. The 10-year yield hit 4.687%, also the highest since January 2025. Translation: investors are now demanding much more to lend money to the United States because they're suddenly worried about war, oil, inflation, and deficits all at the same time. Higher yields mean higher mortgages, higher car loans, higher credit cards, for everybody. And the stock market felt it. The S&P 500 closed down 0.67% at 7,353, its third straight losing session. The Nasdaq dropped 0.84%. The Dow shed 322 points. 3 days of bleeding, no single headline catastrophe, just the slow grind of a market realizing the cheap money era is finally over. And here's where it gets really interesting, because tonight, one company can either save or sink the entire rally. Nvidia reports its first quarter results today, May 20th, after the closing bell. Wall Street consensus is revenue of $79.17 billion and earnings of $1.78 a share. Options traders are pricing a 6.5% post-earnings move in the stock, which translates into a possible $355 billion swing in market capitalization. That number is bigger than the entire market cap of Coca-Cola. One report, 6 minutes, $1 trillion AI narrative. Year-to-date, Nvidia stock is up 19.2%, against just 8.6% for the S&P 500. The entire bull market is effectively leaning on this one company. If management misses on China revenue or hyperscaler demand, the AI trade gets repriced overnight. But it gets worse, because while traders are watching the GPU charts, the war in Ukraine just escalated in a way most Americans never even saw. Last night, Russia launched 154 strike drones at Ukraine. Air defense knocked down 131 of them, an 85% intercept rate, but still 23 impacts on the ground. Ukrainian and Russian troops engaged in 250 separate firefights yesterday alone. In one day, Russia fired 1 missile, 62 airstrikes, dropped 170 guided bombs, and unleashed more than 5,600 kamikaze drones. The Sumy region buried 4 civilians and treated 9 wounded. And here is the part the West is not talking about nearly loudly enough. From May 19th to May 21st, the Russian armed forces are conducting nuclear drills, Moscow's own wording, quote, under conditions of a threat of aggression. Their leadership is in Beijing signing 40 agreements while strategic nuclear forces practice release procedures. Wait until you see what that means for the second front, the one that exploded today in Lebanon. An airstrike on southern Lebanon killed at least 10 people in the past 24 hours, according to Lebanon's own health ministry. 3 women, 3 children. There is supposedly a ceasefire in place between Israel and Hezbollah, the Iran-backed group based in Lebanon. That ceasefire has, in the ministry's words, largely unraveled. And inside Israel, the political fight over Gaza took a turn the United States will not forget. Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich just rejected a direct U.S. request. Washington asked him to release part of the $5 billion in Palestinian tax revenues that Israel is currently withholding, so that money could fund the so-called Board of Peace running post-war Gaza. He flatly said no. The board itself was promised $17 billion in international pledges this year. Almost none of that money has actually arrived. And while governments fight, the money is moving. Bitcoin sat at $76,565 on Tuesday, down $782 in 24 hours, and roughly $29,000 lower than 1 year ago. Bitcoin's market cap is around $1.33 trillion, still nearly 6 times bigger than Ethereum at $233 billion. Technical indicators just flipped from neutral to bearish. Here's where it gets really interesting, because the next number explains why bonds are screaming. Brent crude oil is still trading above $100 a barrel, more than 50% higher than where it sat on February 27th, before the Iran war started. 20% of the world's oil trade flows through the Strait of Hormuz. That strait has been repeatedly contested throughout 2026. Every additional day of fighting prices feed directly into the global economy, which is precisely why long-term Treasury yields just hit 19-year highs. And then, in the quietest story of the day, an architect of the modern financial system died. Barney Frank, the former Massachusetts congressman behind the Dodd-Frank Act, passed away at age 86. Dodd-Frank is the law that rewrote Wall Street after the 2008 crash, the same crash whose Treasury yields we just matched this week. He co-wrote the rulebook for the last crisis. He died as the next one knocks. On the political front, a major blow was just delivered to Republican rebel Thomas Massie, with a backing of Navy SEAL veteran Ed Gallrein in Kentucky's record $32 million House primary. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton was also endorsed over Senator John Cornyn for a runoff on May 26. In Georgia, Democrat Keisha Lance Bottoms locked up the gubernatorial nomination. The MAGA grip on the GOP is tightening, and that's not even the strangest part. Because all 7 of these threads, Beijing, Tehran, the bond market, Nvidia, Ukraine, Lebanon, and the Frank obituary, share one root. They all hinge on whether the White House pulls the trigger on Iran in the next 72 hours. That is the single decision I promised you at the start. 1 man, 1 phone call, and 7 seemingly unrelated stories either calm down or burn together. If the strike happens, oil spikes, Treasury yields blow past 6%, the stock market loses its AI safety net, the Beijing-Moscow alliance tightens, Lebanon erupts, and Bitcoin either crashes or moons as a hedge. If the order doesn't come, the 14-point Iran proposal stays on the table, and the Board of Peace in Gaza gets one more chance at real funding. Markets are pricing both outcomes simultaneously. And in the middle of all this chaos, basketball gave us a moment of relief. Victor Wembanyama dropped 41 points and 24 rebounds. The Spurs beat the Thunder 122-115 in overtime in the Western Conference Finals. He called the game personal afterward. Sometimes the biggest stories of a 24-hour cycle are the ones that have nothing to do with politics and everything to do with reminding us we are still human. So here's the question. Out of these 7 stories, Beijing, Tehran, bonds, Nvidia, Lebanon, Bitcoin, and the Frank obituary, which one do you think historians will say truly reshaped the world this week? Drop your number 1 in the comments. And tell me, yes or no, does the strike on Iran happen in the next 72 hours? Heavy stuff worth a second watch. Like and subscribe if you want more of this. We'll be back soon.